Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joe Torsella. I'm a visiting fellow at Drexel and a trustee here at the National Constitution Center and a former CEO of the National Constitution Center. And normally the way these programs work is that the current CEO or COO of the Constitution Center comes and does some housekeeping and says wonderful things about the moderator, who then says wonderful things about the guest. But I'm both the introducer and the moderator, so you will have to fill in all the wonderful blanks about me yourself. In any case, it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here at the Constitution Center. And the items of housekeeping before we start are, first, that Creating Camelot, which is a terrific new exhibit, opened in mid-February to great reviews, and you can get tickets for it after today's event. There's also a winter sale on now through March 31st of tickets to the exhibit for $10 for adults and $5 for children. Or you can do what I've done, and I think many of you have probably done, that's become a member and save all year long. And third, and this may be my most crucial point, is to remind everyone that now is the time to silence all cell phones, pagers, or other electronic devices. For more information on anything I've just said, except the cell phones, please visit www.constitutioncenter.org. And then finally, for today's program, we will be taking a few audience questions. What we ask is that you jot your questions down on the note cards that should be provided on your seat and hand your card to a staff member in the aisles as the program goes along, and then they'll be funneled up to me. And now, the part where I say wonderful things about our special guest. We're really pleased to have Eric Nelson with us today. He is the Robert M. Barron Professor of Government at Harvard. His research focuses on the history of political thought in early modern Europe and America, and on the implications of that history for debates in contemporary political theory. And he is the author of The Hebrew Republic, The Greek Tradition in Republican Thought, and his latest book, The Royalist Revolution, Monarchy, and the American Founding. He's also a former Marshall Scholar and a Guggenheim Fellow. How old are you, Eric? There's a great line by Tom Lehrer about overachievers. When Mozart was my age, he'd been dead 5 years. The reviews for Dr. Nelson's latest book use many adjectives like provocative, surprising, but the most common is important. And we will probe why that's so in our conversation today. So without further ado, please welcome Eric Nelson. And one final point, you may buy this book in the bookstore downstairs at the end of the program. Now, please welcome Dr. Eric Nelson. Eric, thanks again for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, having read your book, there's a conversation that pops up every so often in American life about whether the Star-Spangled Banner is really our best national anthem. And having read your book, I'm tempted that in addition to America the Beautiful and My Country 'Tis of Thee, maybe My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean should be one of the candidates. For those who haven't read the book, I wonder, can you tell us why you think, if I'm reading it right, that events in 17th century England have a lot to do with what happened at Independence Hall in both the Declaration and the writing of the Constitution?
Sure. Well, first of all, can I just take a minute to thank all of you for coming and the Constitution Center for welcoming me today. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about the book. In answer to the question, in essence, the connection between the 17th century constitutional crisis that occupied the sort of British Isles and the debates that lead up to the American Revolution is in some ways counterintuitive, but was really important, which is to say that, in essence, simplifying greatly, the problem that got the imperial crisis going and that ultimately dismembered Britain's Atlantic Empire was a crisis about parliamentary control, parliamentary jurisdiction. So you had, in the wake of the great victory in the French and Indian War, what we call the French and Indian War, what everyone else in the solar system calls the 7 Years' War, in the aftermath of the British victory, Parliament, famously, decides to try to raise revenue in America to defray some of the costs of the war, and for the first time claimed the right to tax directly the American colonies. The first measures actually weren't direct taxes; they were duties, and really, actually, they were measures to more rigorously enforce existing duties that had been in place for a long time. So initially, the response of British Americans who were opposed to these measures was to try to say something like, well, yes, we acknowledge that Parliament has jurisdiction over America, and we're subjects of the British Empire, but Parliament's jurisdiction stops here, which is to say they can do some set of things, regulate our commerce, govern our foreign policy, and so on, but they can't tax us directly. That was a very narrow position. Most took a somewhat broader position and said, look, we just want to draw a distinction between internal and external powers. So our external affairs are properly under the jurisdiction of Parliament, which is the supreme legislature of the British Empire, but our internal affairs should be left to our own colonial assemblies in conjunction with our governors and the Crown. As they sort of worked through the first period of the debate, because this position provoked fierce opposition both here in British America and in Britain itself, it unleashed this enormous pamphlet war. And these sort of American opposition writers who had become patriots had to sort of keep tacking and responding to these challenges and then maneuvering and sort of repositioning in response to the criticisms. And they ultimately come to realize that this view that they'd been sort of defending wasn't really tenable. Because their explanation for why it was that Parliament didn't have the authority, the jurisdiction to tax America was, famously, we're not represented in Parliament, or we're not represented by Parliament, which are two slightly different, importantly different claims. But of course, the immediate response was, well, hang on. If you're saying you're not represented in Parliament, which is to say that parliamentary laws over you are, in essence, the dictates of a master, right? That is to say, kind of an alien will, because you haven't consented to them. If that's your claim, then surely it follows that all parliamentary legislation is enslaving in relation to America. So in essence, the argument proves too much. So either you're represented or you're not. If you are, then there should be no problem with the taxing. If you're not, then everything is a problem. So ultimately, they sort of maneuver and come to the view that what they should say is that Parliament has no jurisdiction whatsoever over British America. Okay, well, how do you do that? How can you be dominions in which the supreme legislature of Great Britain has no jurisdiction, but you're nonetheless still part of something recognizably called the British Empire? Well, the answer is to say we're connected solely through the person and prerogative of the king. Right? So the king has any number of dominions. These are distinct states, as they said, who just happen to have the same king. So the model that they like is England and Scotland, for example, after the union of the crowns in 1603. So remember, in 1603, Queen Elizabeth dies. So it's the end of the Tudor line, and James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, but he's also James VI of Scotland. And there is otherwise no union of those two realms. It's just two realms, England and Scotland, that happen to have the same king. And that's what they want to say is the case in relation to British America. The king is king of Great Britain, but he's also king of Massachusetts, he's also king of Virginia and New York and so on, just as he continued to be Prince of Hanover, because remember, these are Germans. So that's what they want to say. But the immediate question is, how can you make that model of imperial monarchy fit with the constitutional developments that had taken place in Britain itself in the aftermath of the two parliamentarian revolutions of the 17th century? And so this is where we get to your question. So the English had fought two revolutions, the first in the 1640s, the second in the 1680s, to subject the king to Parliament. Right? So the great settlement that follows the Glorious Revolution and the sort of Whig ascendancy creates this parliamentary monarchy where the king is reconceived as a kind of executive whose function is to see to it through his appointees that parliamentary laws are enforced. No English monarch had vetoed a bill, a parliamentary bill, sort of using what was called technically the negative voice, that is, the right to refuse assent to a bill, since 1707-8, Queen Anne. And actually, most Americans thought mistakenly that no English monarch had vetoed a bill since the Glorious Revolution, right? In Britain, a parliamentary bill. And all of the independent prerogatives of the crown had been sort of subsumed into this parliamentary structure, and Parliament, the king governs through ministers who have to maintain the support of a majority in the House of Commons. And you're moving, quite fast in the 18th century toward the system that we now recognize in Britain, where we have a constitutional monarch who reigns but doesn't rule at all. Now, that wasn't quite true in the late 18th century, but it was increasingly true. And what it meant was this idea of a monarch, a British monarch, separating himself from Parliament, reviving these prerogative powers of the crown that the English had fought these two revolutions to destroy. That model was simply untenable in Britain and terrifying. So, because in essence what these patriots were saying is, look, we want the king using his negative voice, his veto, to impose harmony among the various dominions of his crown. So now you're going to have all these independent legislatures governing these different dominions. How do you make sure they're all on side, that they're all coordinating their commercial policy, their foreign policy, and all the rest? It's simply the king, not via his British ministers, because those are just parliament men, but himself as a personal kind of king-emperor who is going to take it upon himself to govern all of imperial commerce and the relations of the empire with other nations and dominions. And this position, they ultimately come to recognize, was the position defended by the Stuart monarchs of the 17th century. That is to say, as they have this very extensive constitutional debate and debate in political theory with their opponents, they realize, because they get their hands on an interesting set of historical sources, which I can say more about, but just to keep us from going into the weeds at the moment, in essence, the idea is they realize, look, in the 17th century, it was Parliament, it was the great Whig heroes, the sort of heroes in the House of Commons who waged war against Charles I and ultimately beheaded him. These were the same people who had first claimed parliamentary jurisdiction over America. The first bill that legislated for America, that was passed by Parliament successfully, was the Navigation Act of 1651, and it was passed by the so-called Rump Parliament. That is, Parliament can only pass this bill once they've cut off the king's head and usurped the royal prerogative, as these American writers will say. So the idea is the roots of the imperial crisis that ultimately produced the revolution, on this view, are actually to be found in the defeat of the royalist cause in the 17th century. Because it's the royalist defeat, the fact that that Parliament during the interregnum had gotten its sort of pause on British America, that ultimately sowed the seeds of the future disaster. So they're constantly thinking about the relationship between the two.
So going back to what you said, where they're grappling for this
Yeah.
in their arguments with, and this is, I think, the 250th anniversary of the Stamp Act this year.
It is indeed.
Does that make
and the
them,
800th of the Magna Carta, so it's a big year.
duly noted here at the Constitution Center, does that make them royalists, the way your title implies and the way I think most of us would understand the term popularly? Or does that make them clever lawyers who are arguing from expediency? I can say this because I'm married to one. They don't always argue from expediency, but sometimes a lot of the framers were. And aren't they grasping at an argument to justify a position they're already taking?
It's a great question, and it's a perfectly reasonable question. And I have to say, it was initially my suspicion, my own suspicion. So when I began to kind of come across this material, and so first of all, I was just very surprised because coming from, as one who's kind of been taught, as we all have, that really patriots were kind of radical Whigs who were terrified by crown power and executive corruption, and that was their intellectual formation and what they thought they were doing. To find them characterizing themselves as sort of rebels in favor of royal power, in favor of more rather than less monarchy, and taking Charles I and James I as their great constitutional authorities and attacking the parliamentarians of the 17th century. The first most natural response is, this is forensic, right? I mean, look, they're stuck. So you might think, well, look, they sort of know what they want, which is to be left alone, basically. And at the moment, the sort of entity that's not leaving them alone is Parliament, and so they sort of say what they have to say. They need to say something. Any port in the storm, Any port in the storm. But they really had no interest in augmenting royal power in America, and these sort of remarkable pamphlets where they're sort of taking this neo-Stuart line are just kind of they're just kind of contingent responses to this particular political crisis. So how do you test this hypothesis, right? So there's no way ever to be sure about the answer to that kind of question. I mean, sincerity is a very difficult thing to test in the history of ideas. But there are a few basic thoughts that you might have. I mean, one is to sort of see, well, how consistent is the argument? Are they, for example, are they saying different things in private? Different things in letters than in pamphlets, or different things at different stages in the debate, or perhaps even more importantly, what happens when the debate ends, right? So here you have a debate with a definite sort of expiration date, a definite moment when it ends, which is to say independence, right? So you first of all are having a debate. Phase one is a debate about the English Constitution and how it relates to empire. Right? But then the debate changes once independence comes, and now you have a new set of debates in '76, and then '78, and then into the 1780s, which is about the proper form of constitutionalism in the newly independent American states, and ultimately at the federal level. So one way of beginning to approach the answer to that question is to try to see, well, are they repudiating this earlier set of views? Or do they continue, even once the immediate polemical context has passed, to insist on this? And one of the things that I found, frankly, very surprising, is that this group of figures, right, this group of figures who get into print in the late 1760s, early 1770s, defending and sort of really pioneering this very explicitly royalist, kind of Philo-Stuart account of the royal prerogative and the imperial constitution. It's a very familiar cast of characters. This is John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson, James Iredell, Benjamin Rush, people like that. These people immediately become the sort of first major critics of the state constitutions for their weak executives. And they're defending this kind of very this royalist conception of the imperial crisis and this royalist understanding of representation, which they take from the sort of royalist tradition and then continue to be loyal to going forward. And then those are exactly the same people who. It's Wilson and Rush in Pennsylvania, Hamilton in New York, Adams in Massachusetts, Iredell, North Carolina, and so on. They then become the major figures in the 1780s who are defending a very prerogativist presidency. And they draw the connection themselves between their earlier and later thought. So I actually opened the book with this, remarkable statement that James Wilson makes. And Wilson, for my money, actually has a much better claim to the title Father of the Constitution than Madison.
Second that motion.
Yeah. So, Wilson, and certainly is the father of the executive. About that, there is no debate. Wilson had written probably the most important of these pamphlets in the late 1760s, his considerations on the nature of parliamentary power, which is, he writes in 1768, although it's not published till 74. He kind of maintains this view all the way through. And then in the convention, when he makes the motion to create the presidency, the sort of famous motion where he says the executive, the executive shall consist in a single person. Right. And we can come back to that. That's a 17th century phrase, and he knew that. So the executive shall consist in a single person. Edmund Randolph of Virginia immediately, well, first of all, Madison says there's a pause. But after the pause, Edmund Randolph of Virginia immediately objects and says this idea of a single executive with these sweeping prerogatives, including the veto and so on. Remember, no English monarch had the veto since at home, since they thought since 1688. So Randolph says this is a terrible idea because it will be a fetus of monarchy, he says. And we just fought a revolution against the British crown, so it would be insane for us to sort of ape the British system in this regard, having just come clean of them and having just won the war. And Wilson gets up and he answers, he kind of answers a number of his specific points, but his major claim is to say, I would remind the gentleman that in our revolution, we did not rebel against the King of Great Britain, but rather against Parliament. Right? And our quarrel, he says, was never with unitary power, but rather with the corrupt multitude. Right? So this is at the moment in which he's sort of drawing the explicit connection and proposing these prerogatives for the presidency. And that's just one example. They insist all the way through on the account of the imperial crisis that they'd given in the early 70s, in many cases as late as the early 19th century for the ones who actually survived. They still insist that it was the defeat of the Royalist cause that produced the revolution, and this particular prerogativist understanding, this very anti-Whig understanding of proper government in free states, where you have the kind of prerogative-wielding chief magistrate taming the legislature. They never change their minds.
So let's come back to Wilson.
Yeah.
I agree, deserves much more ink than he gets.
Yeah.
But how, if this trajectory is right, there's a real world turned upside down quality to it for most of us, I think. Thinking about the statues of George III being pulled down, and common sense, and the Declaration of Independence, all of which was he has oppressed, he has, all directed at the king. Where did we go so wrong, in your view, in our understanding?
So, first of all, in a sense, we didn't go wrong because everything you just said is true. Right? Although I think
that's good for a moderator.
Yeah. Everything you just said is true. I'll come back to the Declaration because that's actually a little more complicated. But there is no question. So basically, 76, the end of 75, and then really the spring of 76 is this moment of rupture. And what happens is, so in essence, all of these patriots are putting all their eggs in the king's basket. They're petitioning the king. They're urging the king to revive these powers, to start vetoing these parliamentary bills that they find oppressive, to become the kind of king-emperor that they want, and to stand up to this kind of parliamentary oligarchy, as they understand it, this tyrannical legislature, this long parliament, as they kept, as they always referred to it. So, and this continues very, very late, right? So even into 75, when you get Lexington and Concord, and blood is beginning to be spilt. The epigraph I take from in the book is this remarkable letter that a British officer writes to a superior on May 1st of 75, describing the mustering of the Continental Army on Cambridge Common, which is about 100 yards from my office. And he says that the rebels have raised the standard in Cambridge, right? It's the royal standard. And they call themselves the king's troops, and us they call the parliaments. Pretty burlesque, he says. And we have evidence of precisely that phenomenon all over the place in 75, on both sides. That is, it's reported in Patriot newspapers and in British dispatches that even then, May 75, June 75, it's still the king's troops, and the redcoats are the parliament troops, right? What happens? Well, finally you get, in January of 76, word reaches America of the text of the King's speech declaring the colonies in a state of rebellion, which he had, say, a proclamation in August and then the speech at the opening of Parliament in October, and removing them from the royal protection, as the phrase was. That is, giving his armies the right to make war on them, and spurning their political and constitutional case in this famous language where he says they meant only to amuse with protestations of loyalty to me, right? But what actually they wanted was to sort of dismember the British Empire. So George III doesn't, publicly doesn't take seriously, doesn't kind of credit their claims. Although in private we know he credited their claims entirely because he's writing that he is, as he puts it, fighting the battle of the legislature, right? So he knows that the Americans not only are not opposing his prerogative, they're trying to increase his prerogative in ways that he regarded as unconstitutional. That is, he regarded these American proposals for an enhanced royal prerogative as incompatible with the Whig settlement of the Glorious Revolution. And so which is why he doesn't accept them. Also, he's kind of seen this movie before. He's, I'm going to walk out and announce I'm reviving the royal negative and I'm assuming imperial personal control of the empire. They'll have me on the scaffold, by lunch. So he has no interest in doing this, and publicly spurns them. And at this moment, there is a fierce reaction, which is genuinely, for the first time, anti-monarchical, as it had never been before 76. And Paine's Common Sense is kind of providentially timed to come out at exactly this moment in January of 76, and he gives you this ferocious anti-monarch, this kind of attack on kingship as idolatrous and all the rest. And that moment is incredibly formative and explains, more than anything else, why there is not an American monarchy, right? Why there is no new American kingship after the Revolution. But even at that moment, right, the premise is that the king has acted tyrannically insofar as he's refused to be a proper king, right? He's refused to stand up to his own parliament and reassert these ancient powers, right? And even the Declaration of Independence, which by July of 76, obviously a lot of water has passed under the bridge, and you are contending with this kind of fierce anti-monarchism and the sort of serious kind of beginning of the war. Even then, the remarkable thing about the indictment, that you were referring to, is that it returns to this language from the imperial crisis. So why is the king a tyrant? Well, the major indictment, there's a whole set because it's by committee, right? But even at this late date, when the winds have really shifted, you get the claim. So why is he a tyrant? He's a tyrant. I might get the wording slightly wrong, but it's basically the claim is he has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our laws and alien to our Constitution, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, right? Which is all French for he refused to veto these parliamentary bills, right? Who are the others with whom he's combined? The Lords and Commons. Their jurisdiction is alien to our laws, which is to say Parliament has no jurisdiction over America and never did. The king, it was only the king's prerogative that governed America. These are private royal dominions to be governed without Parliament by the king. And because he refused to revive the negative voice, to veto, that is, he assented to these bills instead of striking them down, he was behaving tyrannically, right? And the Declaration, as was kind of pointed out immediately, kind of early and often, by British observers in particular at the time, the word, I mean, the kind of the elephant in the room, the word that does not appear anywhere in the Declaration is the word Parliament, right? Not once, right? They are only others, right? Or your legislature at the end when the text addresses our our fellow subjects in Britain. Why? So on the one hand, the fact that it's the king who's the focus of the Declaration can make it look very anti-monarchist, right? Because you're attacking the king. But actually, as a constitutional juridical matter, right, it's an incredibly royalist way of declaring independence, because they are insisting at that moment that it's only the king from whom they have to declare independence, right? There is no other kind of dependence. They were never subject to Parliament. So there is no independence to be declared. All that has to happen in order, so for example, the British regarded the American Revolution as an act of secession, right? That is, the American colonies are seceding from this juridical unit called the British Empire, right, which has a common sovereign, that is to say, Parliament. The Americans denied that they were seceding. Right? There was nothing from which to secede. They were simply distinct dominions of the same monarch. So all they had to do to become independent was to withdraw their allegiance from him. And why did they withdraw their allegiance from him? Because he refused to be a king. Right? Yeah.
So I want to move this a little bit into the present, but before we do that, just pause for a minute on James Wilson, who...
He's an amazing
truly,
figure. Also a Scot, which is important, because he was very familiar, I mean, in his mind, in his constitutional imagination, he was, maybe of all of them, the most well-briefed about 17th century English constitutionalism. And because he was a Scot, he was very familiar with this union of the crowns model, right? That is, Scotland, after 1603, but before the Act of Union, in the early 18th century. So for that 100 years, more or less, these two kingdoms just had the same king, but were not in any other way connected, and that's his model. But of course, the only reason that that model could actually work in the 17th century is because it was before the independent prerogatives of the monarchy had been absorbed by Parliament. So yeah, so he's very interesting.
If he were here, I think he might say I think first he would say he would agree with you that he should be considered the father of the Constitution.
He would regard himself as very important, yes.
But second, I think he might make 2 points. One is the presidency that we really have, given that there is an override of the veto, given that powers that weren't shared are shared, given that there's an impeachment, understanding he may not have wanted all that, that there's impeachment, understand that it's elective. Is that really all that kingly, number one? And number two, wouldn't he tell you that his vision of popular sovereignty, even to the executive, really makes all this very different from whatever its British forebears might have been?
Those are fantastic questions. Let me separate out the popular sovereignty thing, because I'll come back to that, because that's very important and gets into this stuff about representation that I was alluding to very at the beginning. But so on the presidency, it's also very striking that this group of people that I was talking about were unanimous in wanting more than they got. Right. So Wilson, Adams, Hamilton, they all want an absolute veto that can't be overridden. And they settle for the qualified veto that can, although, interestingly, and this gets to your point about, well, how kingly, they end up making peace with the qualified veto for a very counterintuitive reason, right? That is, it's an argument that Hamilton makes.
I think it'll be exercised more, essentially.
Exactly. Right? It's an argument that Hamilton makes in The Federalist, famously, but Wilson makes it long after the ratification debates are over. He's, when he gives his lectures on law here at what is now Penn in 1790, he's making this claim. He's saying, actually, if you're in favor of prerogative power in the executive and you want as much of it as you can have, you want the veto to be qualified rather than absolute. Why? Well, because if the veto can't be overridden at all, it becomes the nuclear option, right? It becomes incredibly costly as a political matter to use. And the executive is going to be very nervous about using it, and the danger is it will go into abeyance, as it did in Britain. So that's their understanding of what happened. So in essence, remember, there are, throughout the English 18th century, there's this huge debate that's going on about the English Constitution and exactly how to understand it, because it was this very muddy kind of thing, and it was very difficult sometimes to tell sort of which is the cart and which is the horse. So everyone could agree that no English monarch had vetoed a parliamentary bill for generations. Okay, everyone agreed on that. Now, why is that? Well, the Whig answer, the kind of the radical Whig answer is the king hasn't, no monarch has vetoed a bill for 70 years or whatever because they don't have to, because they get their way without using the veto. Why? Because they've bought the legislature, right? So using corruption, using patronage and places and offices, the crown manages to sort of buy enough legislators so that it just reliably gets its way without having to use the veto. So that's the Whig answer. The sort of court answer, most famously given by David Hume, but also others, is no, the reason that the English monarch hasn't used the veto is because no English monarch would dare to use the veto, because in essence this has become merely a pro forma power because Parliament has gobbled up the executive, right? The king is no longer in any but a nominal sense the executive. He's, his ministers rule, and those ministers are Parliament men, and so it's just Parliament all the way down, and that's why there hasn't been a veto. Wilson and Adams and the others take that view, right? The view is the crown has become too weak, right? That's why the veto isn't used, and the qualified veto gives them, they think, a way to avoid that fate. That is, if the veto is very difficult to override but possible, it will embolden the executive to use it more, so that it doesn't go into abeyance. So Hamilton and Wilson flip. Adams never does. Adams, to his dying day, insists it was a terrible mistake not to make the veto absolute. And something very similar is the case with executive appointments. For example, they all wanted complete plenary power in the president to make appointments to executive offices without any advice and consent role for the Senate, which they regarded as an intrusion on the independence of the executive. They settle there. So they're aware that they're not getting everything they want, but it was also quite clear that they'd gotten quite a lot of what they wanted. They got their single executive armed with a veto, the appointment power, and the commander-in-chief power, clemency, and all the rest. And so the issue is really how do you think about this figure relative to something like the King of Great Britain, right? And the answer is, although the figure they got, also, by the way, with the exception of Wilson, who's interesting in this respect, they all wanted a life term, right? All of them. And in fact, the life term was supported by 4 state delegations in the convention, and we know Washington voted for it, and Madison voted for it. And that was also one of the reasons that they discussed impeachment so extensively, because the idea was, particularly if you were going to have a life term, you would need some way of doing the removal. But even once they'd agreed to the sort of 4-year renewable term, obviously with no limits at that point, and many of them just expected that presidents, on good behavior would continue to be reelected indefinitely. Their worry, I mean, impeachment is a funny thing, and which you mentioned. Their argument for why you need impeachment, at least this group and the group, when they're discussing it in the convention, is actually the president is too weak rather than too strong. That's why you need impeachment. Why? Well, because the great thing about a hereditary monarch, and this is a standard royalist argument that they pick up and they never relinquish. The great thing about a hereditary monarch is that his interest is bound up in a very stable fashion with the well-being of the realm as a whole, and his time horizon is very long, because he wants to make sure the realm is in good shape when it gets passed to his son. So he will be incorruptible because his vested interest in the success of the state is so enormous, and he will he will be a kind of good steward of the realm, and he will not listen to any faction. He'll kind of rise above, be the impartial umpire, and sort of seek the good of the realm as a whole, whereas legislatures are inherently factional, partisan, and operate under very short time horizons and therefore perverse incentives. So that's their view. The fact that the president has in theory, a very short term was very worrisome to them for exactly this reason. They worried because the term is so short, this union of interests is not going to be robust, and some foreign power might buy him off. Right? So impeachment is chiefly, for this group, a kind of hedge against the very real possibility that the president's weakness and short term of office will make him a target to corruption by a foreign power.
So we have some great audience questions I want to get to.
We didn't get to popular sovereignty, but maybe in the question.
It's actually in one of the questions as well. But take this quickly into the present for us. Speaking about life terms and hereditary kingships, what does this mean for how you want us to understand American politics today?
Well, so I hope at the very least that that there's a benefit to seeing the American constitutional structure as royalist. Right? That is, as what a 17th century, 18th century person would recognize as a royalist structure, right? As opposed to a Whig structure in which you have sort of parliamentary supremacy and legislative control. And the reason, and this is the most sort of astute observers of the period made this point. I mean, Adams in 1789 was sort of asked, how would you characterize the new Constitution? And he says it creates a limited monarchy. Right? What does he mean? Well, he means that the structure of government that it most resembles, actually, is not certainly kind of parliamentary government at all, not even republican government if you're looking at the kind of classical models or the models of the Italian city-states or the Swiss cantons or the other kind of examples of republican government with which they were familiar. What it most resembled was the mixed monarchy of the English 17th century. And that meant that its distinctive pathologies, the places where it gets into trouble, are exactly the same, right? And I think if you see it that way, it gives you an interesting perspective on the way that the American system either functions or doesn't function, as in, for example, right now. So, in essence, the fact about a mixed monarchy is you have this composite structure where you have king, lords, and commons, right, or president, house, and senate, and none of them has the power to trump any of the others, right? I mean, obviously the president's veto can be overridden.
Depends who you ask in Washington.
Right, but it's very difficult, and so it's very rare. So in general, you need consensus among these groups, these institutions, for the country to be governed at some level, right? Another way of saying that is that if any of these institutions strains its constitutional prerogatives to the limit, there is no remedy, right? So it's not unconstitutional for the House of Representatives to refuse to pass a budget, right? And it's not unconstitutional for the Senate to refuse to confirm all nominees for the executive branch, right? But if they do that, there's no recourse, right? And what happens when that sort of thing occurs is the other branches tend to step in and try to strain their own prerogatives in increasingly sort of dubious and exotic ways to try to sort of, fill the breach. And that produces reaction by the other branches in this kind of escalating constitutional brinksmanship. It's a kind of vicious cycle that gets going. And that is recognizably what caused the English Revolution of the 1640s, right? And so what happened? Well, Parliament, the House of Commons, refused to fund the government. It refused to fund the government. Why? Well, among other things, it basically wanted Charles I to agree to abolish the Church of England, in essence. And he refused, and so they refused, and they wouldn't grant supply, even though the country was in quite serious danger. Right? Ultimately, by the time the Short Parliament is summoned in 1640, there's a Scottish army invading the north of the country. They still won't grant supply. Right? So Charles's response is to rule without Parliament in the so-called personal rule for 11 years. But despite what Whigs say about this, the personal rule was never, never during the personal rule did Charles I claim the right to make law without Parliament. He just tried to make do governing the country under the existing laws without requiring any new ones, right? But he found that he couldn't govern the country just under the existing laws because there was a kind of fiscal security crisis for which he needed revenue. So he then had to act to sort of push his own prerogatives in exotic ways, try to find some way of raising money without a kind of grant of supply from the House of Commons. How does he do that? Ship money. That further antagonizes the legislature. They come back, and it just keeps going until ultimately, you get war. And so the structure, what we've had for the last several years is just the American version of personal rule, right? It's exactly.
You heard it here, folks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Trouble ahead forecast based on past events.
Well,
but
it's not a forecast, but the structure is very similar. And the lesson, if there's a lesson, is that mixed monarchies require discretion. Right? They require forbearance. That is, the people who actually occupy these offices have to be willing not to walk up to the line, because the system actually will not autocorrect if they do. Right?
Those two words, by the way, don't make great political sound bites.
Yeah.
Joe Torsella, forbearance, discretion. They don't work well.
Yeah.
But quick lightning round of some audience questions. I think this one you have answered, but what might have happened if King George...
I think your microphone may have just...
What might have happened if King George III had accepted the invitation from the colonists and stood up to Parliament?
That's a fantastic question. And the answer is probably nothing very good. Because you have to remember now what's going on in Britain, and it's a bit of the story that we've just forgotten. The British opposition to the American cause, British opponents were not accusing Americans of being, crypto-republicans or Democrats or radicals or whatever. They were accusing them of being absolutists and Jacobites, right? That is to say, the British perspective is the American position amounted to a defense of absolute monarchy. That is, they were throwing the colonies entirely into the sort of the balance, as they said, of the crown, and they would consent to be governed at the king's pleasure. Now, that is not true. They were not absolutists at all. They were royalists, and the royalists themselves were never absolutists. They wanted a mixed monarchy. But that was the charge, and it's what it looked like to a post-Glorious Revolution English audience. These arguments, they found it absolutely unthinkable that Americans would cite Charles I as their constitutional authority, right? We fought a revolution to cut off his head. And so when the king makes his speech declaring the colonies in rebellion, of course, the reaction in America is fury, a sense of betrayal, a kind of trauma. In Britain, it's great relief and celebration. And there is this extraordinary moment where virtually every town and guild in the country writes a kind of loyal address to the king, congratulating him on refusing to take the bait. So they all say, look, these Americans we're offering you an unconstitutional increase in your prerogative, and we're undoing the Glorious Revolution, but you, thank God, are a virtuous monarch, and you were above the temptation. Right? You would be a parliamentary monarch or nothing. So exactly these folks who were congratulating him for refusing the bait, to take the bait, would have been
off with his head.
Would have gone in a very, very different direction if he'd announced that he was prepared to play ball in the way that Americans wanted. I mean, it was simply unthinkable, and it created a lot of confusion for that reason. So, I mean, the American cause, of course, had famous English defenders.
Who were mostly Whigs.
Who were mostly Whigs, and this was infuriating to the ministry, Lord North, very famously, there's this amazing moment in the debate, I guess it's 75, they're debating the Coercive Act, the sort of wisdom of them, the reaction to them, and Charles Fox gets up and sort of, defends the Americans, and North gets up and says, I think you're very confused, right? I mean, my understanding is that Whigs are supposed to assert the right of the people and their parliament, and Tories are supposed to talk about the prerogative. Well, in this context, the administration, that is us, we the ministry, are vindicating the rights of the people and their parliament, and the Americans talk of belonging to the crown, and this is the language of Toryism, right? So there was this kind of mismatch. Whigs were sort of singularly unable to take seriously what the Americans were saying about their own position, whereas those on the other side were taking it very seriously. There is one interesting exception to that, that is someone who supports the American cause precisely because he recognizes that it's an attempt to reset the English Constitution in favor of the crown, and that's actually Boswell, also a Scot. Yep. So there you go.
So speaking of Scots, the question we almost got to, James Wilson supported a strong executive, but he was also the founder who most strongly supported the sovereignty of the people.
Yes.
In your view, how do a strong executive and popular sovereignty fit together?
I'm so glad you asked. This gets us into this question about the theory of representation, and it's a little involved, but I can state the basic issue very simply. The first is to say that Royalists, despite what Whigs said about them, were themselves theorists of popular sovereignty. That is, the argument, or rather the premise, the crucial premise that you need in order to make the argument that royalism and popular sovereignty are incompatible is the premise that the king can't represent the people, right? That's what you need to believe in order to think that a royalist constitution and popular sovereignty, the rule of the people, are incompatible, right? Because if you think that a king can be the representative of the people just like a legislature, then the king is the agent of the people just like a legislature, and the people may be said to be sovereign and may be said to be ruling, right? They may be represented. The only power that exists over them is representative power, so that when the king acts, it's in a sense they themselves who are acting. Why wouldn't you think that? Well, Whigs, of course, don't think that. Whigs think a king can't represent the people, and this was one of the major arguments of the English Revolution. The parliamentarians make the argument that, the whole point is to say that Charles I's negative, his right to veto bills, is enslaving, right? It's incompatible with the freedom of subjects. Why? Well, because the king can't represent the people, and so if you need his permission, if the people need his permission in order to do anything, then they're no better than slaves. They're just depending on the grace of their master, who might be a nice master or a not nice master, but anyway, they sort of depend on his say-so. And they have a whole argument for why this is true, which I won't get into because it's slightly involved, but it's basically that only an assembly that sort of looks like the people, that's numerous and composed in a proportional way, only an assembly like that can represent the people. So the king, you can have a king on this view, but he has to be a pure executive. That is, he can have no role in the making of law. The law has to be made by representatives of the people, and then if you want the king to sort of, as they say, be the sheriff enforcing the law, fine. But that's it. The royalist response, right, and the most famous version of it is in Hobbes, but Hobbes's argument was, in this respect, was not original at all, is to say, nonsense. What it means to represent someone is just to be authorized by that person to act in their name, like a lawyer. Your lawyer represents you. Your lawyer doesn't have to look like you. You can be represented by anyone you choose. Likewise, a people. can be represented by any institutional structure it wants. If it wants a king, if it authorizes the king to govern them, no problem. Then he is an authorized representative, and they are self-governing. If they don't, and they just want an assembly, that's fine too. Or if they want a mix, right? But the proper understanding of constitutionalism is to say that that it's not just that the House of Commons represents the people and the House of Lords just represent themselves and the king just represents himself. The right way of understanding it is that they all represent the people because they've all been authorized to speak and act in the name of the people, not because they've all been elected. Remember, at this period, 9/10 of Englishmen didn't even have the franchise in order to elect members to the House of Commons, and of course the other two branches were hereditary. So it's not election, but rather the kind of tacit consent that we give to the underlying institutional scheme. And according to that, if we've given that consent, then a hereditary monarch can be our representative in exactly the same sense that an elected legislature can be our representative. And a fortiori, even more so, a single chief magistrate who has sweeping prerogative powers, but who isn't a hereditary magistrate, right? So this was the argument that the sort of person who understood it most systematically and made it most relentlessly was John Adams. Wilson himself actually had a slightly different version of it, but the basic point stands. That was how Wilson would have explained these two things, right, and how they go together, a kind of prerogativist single chief magistrate wielding sweeping powers and popular sovereignty. Because as long as the chief magistrate has been authorized, then the people are sovereign.
So one more of these, and then a quick closing question for everyone. But was there a similar debate in Canada during this period?
It's a very good question. And the first thing I want to say is I'm not an expert on the Canadian sources. So what I'm going to say is
you're writing more books,
quite,
I assume, right?
quite general and sort of gestural. In general, the answer is no. And this is one of the major reasons, of course, why many, if not most, loyalists who fled the United States fled to Canada, right? Fled to British Canada. That was still, I mean, you know, the Canadian opinion, which is why they did not join, at least in part, why they did not join the revolutionary cause, although they were invited. In some cases, very belligerently invited to join in. They were still operating solidly from within the sort of Whig tradition, which is one of the things that makes this a very ironic story in some ways. I mean, that is to say, we think of the Loyalists as kind of crown men, right, and the revolutionaries as Whigs. But from a very important point of view, as they all realized at the time, it was the other way around. It was the Tories with a lowercase t, the sort of loyalists in America and in Canada and in Britain, who were asserting the rights of Parliament as the supreme legislature, and were terrified by this kind of prerogativist, sort of royalist line that was emerging from the colonies. And it's the Patriots who were asserting this this quite surprising sort of enhanced role for the prerogative. So the answer is no. I mean, Canadian opinion tended to be quite respectably Whig.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. There are some wonderful questions here, which I encourage all of you to ask the author when you go downstairs to say hello and buy the book. The closing quote, for those of you who haven't thought of your own question, is from Eric's last chapter, where he writes, "On one side of the Atlantic there would be kings without monarchy, on the other, monarchy without kings. Which of the two sides got the better of the bargain is, of course, an open question, but at least it's the right one." So if you don't have one of your questions that didn't get answered, you might ask him which he thinks got the better of that bargain. But with that, I want to thank all of you for making this interesting, and thank Eric Nelson for a terrific program.
Thank you.